Tonight's case begins in a quiet corner of Victorian England, in a small house where nothing appeared out of place. The neighbours heard no screams, the streets remained calm. And yet, behind those walls, one of the most disturbing crimes of the 19th century had already unfolded. This is not a case of sudden madness or uncontrolled violence. It is a case of patience, of routine, of a life that unravelled slowly, piece by piece, until there was no way to hide what had been done. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you appreciate carefully researched cases that follow the facts exactly as they happened, consider liking the video and subscribing to the Brief Ledger. It helps keep these stories alive. Tonight we begin in Ireland, in the year 1849, in the rural county of Wexford. It was here that Catherine Webster was born into a working family of modest means. Her parents were known locally as respectable and industrious people, and although they possessed little wealth, they made efforts to raise their children with discipline and order. From an early age, however, Catherine began to show signs of behavior that set her apart. She developed a reputation for dishonesty and was frequently reprimanded for stealing. These incidents were not isolated, and as she grew older, they became more serious. By her teenage years, her conduct had drawn the attention of authorities. In 1864, Catherine was convicted of larceny and sent to prison. She was still young, but the sentence marked her first formal encounter with the legal system. When she was released several years later, the circumstances of her life had not improved. Employment opportunities were limited, and her reputation followed her. In 1867, still in her teens, she left Ireland. She took money without permission, purchased a ticket, and crossed to England in search of a new beginning. It was a decisive departure not only from her family but from any remaining stability she had known. Her release did not mark a return to order. Instead, it marked the beginning of a pattern that would follow her for the rest of her life. After leaving Ireland, Catherine Webster arrived in Liverpool, a city far removed from the rural life she had known. The transition offered opportunity, but it also exposed her to the harsh realities faced by the urban poor. Work was difficult to secure, wages were low, and survival often depended on circumstance rather than planning. Within a short time, Catherine again came to the attention of authorities. In 1868, she was convicted of theft and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. The pattern established in Ireland continued. Release was followed by instability, and stability was followed by another offence. When she was released in 1872, Catherine moved to London, believing that the capital would offer greater opportunity. There she found employment in domestic service, moving between households and relying on acquaintances for introductions. For brief periods, she appeared settled. During this time, she entered into a relationship with a man named Strong. The relationship offered temporary security, but it did not last. Catherine became pregnant and gave birth to a son in April 1874. Soon afterward, Strong left her, and she was once again left to support herself. With limited options, she returned to theft. In 1875, she was imprisoned again, followed by a further sentence in 1877. Each release brought the same result: movement, employment, dismissal, and arrest. By the end of the decade, Catherine Webster had served multiple prison sentences, lost custody of her child, and exhausted the tolerance of those around her. When she arrived in Richmond in 1879, she was not seeking a new beginning. She was seeking survival. Following her release from prison, Catherine Webster made her way to London, drawn by the promise of employment and the anonymity of the growing city. The capital offered work for women willing to enter domestic service, and Catherine was able to secure positions through recommendation and necessity rather than reputation. She initially found employment in Wandsworth, working in private households where her duties were routine and her presence largely unremarkable. The work provided food and shelter, but little stability. Her positions were short-lived, and she moved frequently, relying on acquaintances to secure her next place of employment. During this period, she became associated with Henry and Anne Porter, a couple who assisted her in finding domestic work. Through them, she continued to move between households, performing cleaning and household labor where needed. Though she appeared capable of fulfilling her duties, she never remained in one place for long. Over time, Catherine drifted westward into the borough of Hammersmith. The pattern remained unchanged: brief employment followed by departure, each position lasting only as long as it took for tensions to emerge or circumstances to shift. Despite this instability, domestic service offered Catherine a form of structure she had not otherwise maintained. It also placed her in proximity to households of higher social standing, an environment she would soon enter more permanently. It was through these connections that Catherine Webster was introduced to a household in Richmond, a house that would soon become central to everything that followed. In early 1879, Catherine Webster arrived in the Richmond district of London, a quieter and more affluent area than those she had previously known. It was here that she entered the household of Julia Thomas, who lived alone at 2 Mayfield Cottages on Park Road. Julia Thomas was a twice-widowed woman in her mid-50s. She was financially secure and maintained a respectable position within the local community. Having no immediate family living with her, she decided to employ a housekeeper to assist with domestic duties and to provide a degree of companionship. The arrangement also allowed her greater freedom to visit friends and entertain guests, something she valued as part of her social standing. Catherine was taken on in this role. At first, the arrangement appeared practical and unremarkable. She was provided with lodging and wages in exchange for household work, and there was no immediate cause for concern. However, differences between the two women soon became apparent. Julia was orderly and particular, paying close attention to cleanliness and routine. Catherine, by contrast, was less disciplined in her habits. She began spending increasing amounts of time away from the house and was known to frequent public houses in the area. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere inside the home grew strained. Julia became dissatisfied with her housekeeper's conduct, while Catherine appeared resentful of the scrutiny placed upon her. The balance between employer and servant began to erode. By the end of her first month in the house, it had become clear that the arrangement could not last. And when Julia Thomas finally decided to dismiss her housekeeper, neither woman could have known what would follow. By the end of February 1879, the situation inside the house on Park Road had deteriorated. Julia Thomas had grown increasingly dissatisfied with her housekeeper's conduct, particularly her absences and frequent visits to public houses. After several weeks of mounting tension, she informed Catherine Webster that her services were no longer required. The dismissal was not immediate. Catherine, having nowhere else to go, asked to remain for a short time while she sought alternative lodging. Julia agreed, allowing her to stay for a few additional days. The arrangement was uneasy, and the atmosphere in the house became strained. Sunday, March the 2nd, followed its usual pattern. Julia attended the evening church service, as she did regularly. Catherine, who was expected to be preparing to leave the household, instead went out to a nearby public house. When she returned later that evening, Julia was already home. An argument took place inside the house. The details of what was said were never recorded, and no witnesses were present. There was no report of raised voices or disturbance beyond the walls of the property. After the exchange, Julia went upstairs to her bedroom intending to change. Catherine followed her. What followed took place inside the narrow stairwell of the house, out of sight of neighbors and without witnesses. The events that followed unfolded quickly and without witnesses. After the argument upstairs, Catherine Webster struck Julia Thomas with the handle of an axe. The blow did not immediately kill her. Julia moved toward the stairway, attempting to descend, but Catherine followed. A second blow was delivered, and Julia fell on the stairs. A final strike ended her life. No cries were reported by neighbors, and no disturbance was noted outside the house. The incident took place entirely within the narrow interior of the property. Once Julia Thomas was dead, Catherine remained alone in the house. There was no immediate attempt to flee. Instead, she paused and assessed her situation. Having previously served prison sentences, she understood the consequences of discovery and the certainty of punishment that would follow. Rather than seeking help or leaving the scene, she chose to act. The body was left where it had fallen while she considered her next steps. The house itself was quiet, and no one outside appeared aware of what had occurred inside its walls. From this point forward, her actions were deliberate. The focus shifted from confrontation to concealment, and from conflict to calculation. Rather than leave the house, Catherine Webster began to consider how the body might be made to disappear. In the hours following the killing, Catherine Webster did not leave the house. Instead, she began the process of removing all evidence of what had taken place. Her actions unfolded over several days and were carried out methodically. The body was dismembered inside the house. Portions were placed in the laundry copper, which was ordinarily used for washing clothes, and heated. Residue from this process was later burned in the kitchen fire. What remained was divided into parcels and wrapped in cloth and paper. During this time, Catherine continued to move about the neighborhood without drawing attention. She was seen entering public houses and walking the streets as usual. Nothing in her manner suggested urgency or distress. Some of the remains were disposed of in refuse heaps nearby. Others were carried to the River Thames and thrown from bridges under cover of routine errands. The process was repeated over several days, with no attempt made to leave the area immediately. Inside the house, Catherine took steps to present herself as its occupant. She wore Julia Thomas's clothing and jewelry and began referring to the property as her own. Furniture and personal items were gathered, some set aside for sale. By the time she finally left the house, little remained inside to indicate what had occurred. But beyond its walls, the evidence had already begun to emerge. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the house on Park Road, but from the River Thames. In early March 1879, a box containing human remains was discovered near Barnes Bridge. The finding was reported to police, who soon confirmed that the contents were parts of a human body. Shortly afterward, a severed foot was found in Twickenham. Examination showed that the remains belonged to the same individual, though identification was not possible at that stage due to the absence of the head. As the investigation began, Catherine Webster continued to move freely through Richmond. She visited tradesmen and attempted to sell furniture from the house on Park Road, presenting herself as the property's owner. She also continued wearing Julia Thomas's clothing, drawing quiet notice from those familiar with the household. Suspicion grew among neighbors when Julia was not seen for several days. When questioned, Catherine claimed that her employer had left the area. The explanation did little to ease concerns, particularly after Catherine abruptly departed Richmond with her child. Police soon entered the house on Park Road. Inside, they found signs of disturbance, burned material in the fireplace, traces of blood, and a greasy residue lining the laundry copper. These findings, combined with the discoveries near the river, shifted the investigation decisively. By the time authorities connected the evidence, Catherine Webster had already left Richmond, but she had not gone far. Following the discovery of evidence at the house on Park Road, police began tracing Catherine Webster's movements. Among the items left behind were documents that led investigators to an address in Ireland. Acting on this information, authorities contacted their counterparts across the Irish Sea. Catherine was located at her uncle's farm and arrested on March 28, 1879. At the time of her arrest, she was still wearing clothing that had belonged to Julia Thomas. Her child was taken into care, and she was placed in custody before being returned to London to face charges. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on July 2, 1879. Public interest in the case was considerable. Large crowds gathered outside the court, and newspapers reported daily on the proceedings. The case was treated as one of the most disturbing crimes of the period. The prosecution presented physical evidence recovered from the house and from the River Thames, along with witness testimony detailing Catherine's actions in the days following the disappearance of Julia Thomas. Particular attention was paid to her attempts to sell household goods and her sudden departure from Richmond. Although the victim's head had never been recovered, the jury accepted the circumstantial evidence presented. Catherine denied responsibility and attempted to place blame on others, but her account failed to withstand examination. After several days of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Sentencing followed swiftly, but the case would not end with the closing of the court. Following her conviction, Catherine Webster was sentenced to death. In an effort to delay the sentence, she claimed to be pregnant. A medical examination was ordered, but the claim was found to be false. An appeal for clemency was submitted on her behalf, but it was rejected. In the days that followed, Catherine gave a confession detailing the events surrounding the death of Julia Thomas and the disposal of her remains. The statement came only shortly before her execution and offered no new evidence that altered the outcome of the case. On July 29, 1879, Catherine Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. She was 40 years old. With her death, the case appeared to be closed. One element, however, remained unresolved. The head of Julia Thomas had never been recovered, and its whereabouts were unknown. For more than a century, the matter remained unanswered. Then, in 2010, excavation work was carried out near the site of a former public house that Catherine had frequented. During the work, a human skull was discovered buried beneath Victorian-era tiles. Examination revealed injuries consistent with those described in the original case, as well as signs of exposure to heat. Although no DNA comparison could be made, the findings aligned with historical records. With that discovery, a case that began in a quiet house in Richmond more than 130 years earlier was finally brought to a close.